The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. Jesus spoke to the crowds and to his disciples, saying, "The scribes and the Pharisees have taken their seat on the chair of Moses. Therefore, do and observe all things whatsoever they tell you, but do not follow their example. For they preach, but they do not practice. They tie up heavy burdens, hard to carry, and lay them on people's shoulders, but they will not lift a finger to move them. All their works are performed to be seen. They widen their phylacteries and lengthen their tassels. They love places of honor at banquets, seats of honor in synagogues, greetings in marketplaces, and the salutation, Rabbi. As for you, do not be called Rabbi. You have but one teacher, and you are all brothers. Call no one on earth your father. You have but one Father in heaven. Do not be called master. You have but one master, the Christ. The greatest among you must be your servant. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, but whoever humbles himself will be exalted." The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ. Well, good morning, church. Good morning. Who said that? Who said Father? Yeah, you did. Didn't you hear what Jesus just said? Call no man on earth your father. What are we going to do with? I'll see you in confession on Saturday, okay? But seriously, what do we do with that, right? I mean, that's actually something that friends of mine who are Protestant have asked me, why do you as Catholics, why do they call you Father when Jesus clearly says not to do it? And I try to help them see the problem's even larger than that if you're going to take it literally, that not only am I called Father, and guys like me who do this called Father, but to those who aren't even Catholic, have you ever celebrated Father's Day? Given your dad a card that says, Happy Father's Day, you're calling him Father. Or it gets even more complicated. Call no one Rabbi, you have but one teacher. How many of us have honored teachers that we have had? Or I was smiling yesterday because I have friends who were in a Taekwondo competition and they did really, really well. And they thanked their master for having helped them do so well. What do we do with this? I mean, you even go to a Protestant church, if they're having a guest speaker who is the leader of the synagogue, they say, oh, Rabbi so-and-so is coming. All over the place, we are doing exactly what Jesus today says not to do. How do you make sense of that? Well, briefly, Jesus is doing here what he does in other places in the Scripture, like when he tells you to pluck out your eye if it offends you, or chop off your hand, right? He doesn't mean it literally. The Jewish mind loved hyperbole, exaggeration to drive a point home. And that's what Jesus is doing here. Call no one Rabbi, call no one teacher, call no one Father, call no one Master to drive home a point. And what's the point? Well, in the context of talking about how people love to widen their tassels and big phylacteries and seating banquet seats of honor and synagogue seats of honor and being called Father in the marketplace and on, the concept is, don't do that because we as human beings, well, we have this flaw. Marks of distinction, marks of honor, whether it's titles or uniforms or special chairs, whatever it is, tend to inflate our ego, tend to help us start thinking about ourselves and how wonderful we are more than the people we are called to be. And Jesus really has that problem with the scribes and the Pharisees. You may note today that he's really pretty harsh with them. He says to his crowd and his disciples, the scribes and the Pharisees, do whatever they tell you, but do not follow their example. And he goes on to list all these terrible things they do. And we hear often in the Scriptures that Jesus has a bit of a confrontation with scribes and Pharisees. So it might behoove us to know, who are these people? Who are these groups of people that Jesus constantly wrestles with? The scribes and the Pharisees. Well, the scribes, as their name indicates, were responsible for transcribing essentially the scriptures from scroll to scroll to make sure that it was preserved and to keep it alive for people. So that's what they did. But you have to remember, in a society that was mostly illiterate, these folks were educated. And they were the ones who, in transcribing, had learned the Mosaic law, the law that Moses gave, particularly in the first 5 books of the Old Testament. They called that the Torah. So from the Torah came the Mosaic law. And the scribes knew it because they were the guys who were writing it. They also lived in a society where secular law, civil law, and religious law both emanated from the law of Moses. And so the scribes also acted as lawyers. They were the ones who knew these things. In particular, from the Torah, those first 5 books of the Bible, they had determined there were 613 precepts of the law that Moses had given, that God had given to Moses, Moses passed along. 613. The problem with the 613 precepts of the law from Moses was they were sort of general principles. And you know people, you know what we're like. When it comes to law, we want to know precisely what it requires. It's not enough to be general. We want to get specific. What does the law require of me so I don't break it? I don't want to break it, but sometimes I also want to know what the minimum is that I have to do, right? So what is the law? And so the scribes actually set out to help people. It was their intention to make it clear how you keep the law of Moses. So you got 613 precepts of the law, and there's probably 10 of them that we are most familiar with, and those are the 10 commandments. So let's take one of those. We'll leave the other 612 behind. We'll take one. Keep holy the Sabbath. Great. I love that idea. I understand that it would honor God, but how do I do that? Practically speaking in my life, Mr. Scribe, how do I keep holy the Sabbath? So the scribes went to work. And they found a vast number of ways of things that you should or should not do on the Sabbath to keep it holy. Let's take one of them. No servile work. Excellent. To keep holy the Sabbath, no servile work. You know the next question, but what makes for servile work? Well, the scribes go to work again. They find a vast number of things that become servile work. We'll take one of them. Don't walk too far. Because if you walk too far, it can go from being recreation to being work, right? I don't know about you, ever had the experience of you go for a hike and then suddenly you realize you're not sure where you are? And the fun becomes work. I got to find my way home. What am I doing? We don't want to go there on the Sabbath. So, great. Keep holy the Sabbath, and one way I do that is no servile work, and one thing I do there is don't walk too far. How far is too far? And does my motivation matter? If I'm walking to go help someone in need, does that change how far I can walk? So you can see where this goes. I mean, that's one commandment and one way of keeping in one little, it got huge. It just kept multiplying on them, more and more clarification, more and more information, more and more. Eventually it becomes codified. All these interpretations, all these considerations become codified in what's called the Talmud, T-A-L-M-U-D, which was enormous and huge, and absolutely no one could possibly keep it. It's the burden laid on people's shoulders that no one lifts a finger to help. However, there was a group that tried to keep it perfectly, and those were the Pharisees, close allies of the scribes. And the Pharisees, too, started out with a really good reason. The Pharisees were actually a group of lay people. And about 200 years before Jesus came along, the Jewish nation lived under the rule of a Greek king, Antiochus IV. And when they lived under the rule of the Greek king, a lot of the Jewish people started to abandon their faith and just accept and live in the secular culture of their world. But the Pharisees, these lay people, said, oh, no. We are going to stay faithful to our faith. In the face of this secular culture, we are going to live our faith, and we are going to live it perfectly so that everyone can see it and will give witness to it. Great. Good for them. Make a proud statement, a witness to their faith in the face of secular culture. But over time, they became overly legalistic, very self-absorbed, and overly harsh on people who didn't try to do what they did. It became all about keeping the rules, the regulations, everything codified there. So you can see with that background why Jesus would say to the crowds and the disciples, listen to the scribes and the Pharisees, because they're on the seat of Moses, that Mosaic law, those first 5 books, the God-given law, listen to what they tell you. But don't practice all this that they preach because they don't live it. It doesn't do what it's supposed to do. Those are the people, and that's why Jesus is constantly having a problem with them. Both groups start out with good intentions, but it became more about them than it did about the people they were supposed to serve. I don't know about you, but I think when I reflect on my life honestly, I find, and maybe you find, that without meaning to, there can be a little bit of scribe and a little bit of Pharisee in me, right? I mean, again, look at the scribes. Their intention was, let's go to work and do something good for people. Provide some help, some clarification, make this work for people. And I think that often is the case in our lives, perhaps, that we get a job, we start a career, we go to work with the intention of, I'm going to provide for my spouse, for my children, for my community. Work is an end to a means to do something good for people. But over time, the work just continues to grow and expand, becomes something that almost no one could bear. Suddenly, I have to go in early, I have to stay late, I have to work every weekend. And the very people who we went to work to help are now getting hurt by our absence and our inability to be with them because I gotta get to the work. That can happen in our lives. Also, there can be moments when we're a little bit like Pharisees. The focus of our faith becomes the law, the rules. What does the church want of me? And we think if I'm making it to church on Sunday, not eating meat on Fridays during Lent, going to holy days of obligation, I'm doing okay, I got this all. And we completely miss the invitation of God to that deep and personal friendship with Him that actually gives the law its meaning. The law's not bad, it has its place when it's listened to correctly. But it can cause us to miss that God calls us to a friendship with Him, not legal observance. Laws will never get you to the friendship. And it's that friendship that will also give meaning to our work. It all works out when God is at the center and we're friends with Him. You may remember last week, Jesus actually took the 613 precepts of the law and brought it down to 2. Love God, love your neighbor. On that, all the law and the prophets is based. And today, He makes it even more practical than that. He gives us the out, the way to avoid being like the scribes and like the Pharisees, when He says to the crowd and the disciples, be of service to the other. The one who will be great is the one who is of service, who humbles himself to serve another person. And of course, He's the example for us of a living relationship with God and someone who spent his entire life, even gave his life in service to others. That gives meaning to our work, and that gives meaning to the law when we love God and love our neighbor and live our lives in humble service to one another.